Right at my father's funeral, my husband slipped me a piece of paper, sign a renunciation of inheritance in favor of my mother, or I'll file for divorce. My mother-in-law watched with greedy anticipation. I took the pen and calmly signed it. But when they came to the notary a week later, his words made their faces freeze. Betty sat by her father's bedside, changing the damp cloth on his forehead. His emaciated, parchment-yellow face was almost unrecognizable to her. Where had that strong, ironic man gone, the former investigator Derek Brown, who could put any rude person in their place with just one look? Cancer was devouring him before her eyes, turning him into a helpless, fragile shadow. Betty had been caring for him for the past 6 months, torn between her work as a landscape designer, home, and the hospital. She had lost weight, dark circles formed under her eyes, but she did not complain. It was her duty. Her last chance to be close to the person she loved most. Betty, daughter, her father barely opened his eyes. His voice was a faint whisper. "I'm here, Daddy." "I'm right here," she said, taking his dry, hot hand. "Take the folder in the desk drawer," he whispered, struggling to speak. "Keep it for yourself and show it to no one, do you hear me? No one, until the time comes. You'll understand when." Betty silently nodded, holding back tears. She found an ordinary cardboard folder in the old writing desk drawer and put it in her bag without even looking inside. There was no time for that now. That evening, when she returned to their mortgaged 2-bedroom apartment in Chicago, she was greeted by her husband Thomas and her mother-in-law Serena, who had been visiting them more often lately. "How is he?" Thomas asked, kissing her on the cheek. He smelled of expensive cologne and dinner, which his mother had apparently prepared. "Bad," Betty replied quietly. "The doctor said there are only a few days left." "Oh, God, what a tragedy!" Serena exclaimed, flinging her hands as she came out of the kitchen. She wore Betty's apron and held a ladle like a scepter. "Such a man is leaving us. A treasure, not a man. Thomas and I are so worried about you, my dear girl." Betty silently went to the bathroom. The fake sympathy made her nauseous. For the past few months, every conversation with her mother-in-law and husband boiled down to one thing. They always started with questions about her father's health and ended with discussions about his property. "Betty, hasn't your father said what he wants to do with the country house?" Just casually, Thomas would ask. "Such an asset is just sitting there. Maybe we should sell it? Pay off our mortgage?" "Thomas, he's dying," Betty would cut him off. "But I'm not rushing anything. I'm just thinking about the future. About our future." Serena, a former chief accountant, was even more blunt. "Betty, you have to be practical. Emotions are fine, but life goes on. Your father has a nice downtown apartment, a house, a car, and probably savings. You need to think ahead about how to manage all of it properly to avoid paying extra taxes." Betty looked at their businesslike, concerned faces and felt an icy wall grow between her and her husband. The man she loved, the one she married 4 years ago, seemed to have vanished. In his place was a calculating stranger who saw her family tragedy only as a financial opportunity. They had married for love. Thomas, a handsome manager at a car dealership, knew how to impress. He courted her beautifully, spoke of eternal values, of family. Betty, a romantic and slightly naive girl, believed him. Her father had been cautious about his son-in-law from the start. "He's empty, Betty. A pretty facade, but hollow inside. And his mother is a vulture. Stay away from her." But Betty didn't listen. She was in love. Her father had paid nearly the entire down payment for their apartment and helped with monthly payments whenever Thomas had temporary work difficulties. Thomas and Serena took this help for granted. That evening, after talking to her father, Betty sat in the kitchen drinking cold tea. Thomas and his mother were whispering excitedly in the living room. She couldn't hear the words, but she sensed it. They were dividing the skin of a bear not yet killed. Her bear. The phone rang. Betty saw her father's doctor's number on the screen and felt a chill. "Betty," came the tired voice on the line. "Come quickly. Your father, he just..." Betty dropped the phone. The world shattered into 1,000 pieces. She didn't hear Thomas enter the kitchen or what he was asking. She just stared at a single point, her ears filled with her father's deathbed whisper, "You'll understand when." It seemed she was beginning to understand. The time had come. But she still didn't know what a terrible ordeal awaited her before the curtain would rise. The hospital greeted her with its bureaucratic silence and the smell of bleach. Her father lay on his bed, covered with a sheet over his head. It was over. Betty stood over him, unable to move, a single thought pounding in her mind. I didn't make it to tell him how much I love him." Thomas and Serena arrived half an hour later. Her mother-in-law was dressed entirely in black, as if prepared in advance. Her face wore a mask of grief, but her eyes darted around, sharp, calculating. "My dear girl, what a tragedy," she whispered, hugging Betty. Her embrace was cold, like marble. "But we must hold ourselves together. Business doesn't wait." And indeed, it didn't wait. No sooner had the doctor issued the death certificate than Serena was already springing into action. "So, we need Derek Brown's documents," she said businesslike, addressing Betty, who was still in shock. "Passport, Social Security, insurance, where did he keep them?" "In the safe, in the office," Betty replied mechanically. "Excellent. Thomas, you'll go with Betty to their house to collect them. I'll call the funeral agency. Everything must be organized at the highest level. Derek deserves it." At her father's apartment, Betty moved as if in a dream. She opened the safe and retrieved the necessary papers. Thomas stood beside her, peering over her shoulder. "And what are these folders?" he asked, pointing to neat stacks of documents. "For the apartment, for the house?" "Yes," Betty nodded. "We should take these too." At that moment, Serena intervened. She had apparently already arrived and was holding court in the kitchen, brewing herself some tea. "To make sure they don't get lost, put them in a separate bag, son. We'll keep them safe with us. It's more reliable." "No," Betty's voice sounded unexpectedly firm. "They will stay here." Her mother-in-law raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Betty, you're not in the state to make decisions right now. You might lose them, mix them up. These are serious documents. Let Thomas and me keep them temporarily, for your own good." "I said no," Betty repeated, looking her straight in the eye. "These are my father's things, and they will stay in his house." Serena pressed her lips together but didn't argue. She exchanged a meaningful glance with her son. Betty understood. They would not back down. The next 2 days turned into an endless stream of people, phone calls, and condolences. Betty barely slept, trying to manage the funeral arrangements. Or rather, she tried to manage them, but Serena intercepted every step. "Why such an expensive restaurant for the wake?" she protested. "There's a cafeteria across the street, cheap and simple. The deceased doesn't care anymore, and the living could use the money." "Mom wanted it to be beautiful," Betty whispered. "Who cares what your mom wanted?" Her mother-in-law cut her off. "Now we decide. And we've decided to save." Thomas, as always, sided with his mother. "Betty, Mom's right. Now is not the time for unnecessary spending. We have a mortgage, loans." "You have loans?" Betty asked. My father paid off your last car loan 2 months ago. Thomas blushed and looked away. Well, that was a while ago. Situations change. Every conversation left a bitter taste in her mouth. They weren't grieving with her. They were counting money. They saw her future inheritance as their own asset. On the day of the funeral, a cold, piercing rain fell. When the coffin was lowered into the grave, Betty felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. If it hadn't been for her friend Katia, holding her tightly by the arm, she probably would have fallen. Thomas stood nearby, but he seemed so distant, so foreign. He was looking more at his mother than at his wife. At the wake, in that very cheap cafeteria that her mother-in-law had insisted on, Serena gave a pompous speech about what a remarkable man Derek had been and how much they all loved him. Betty listened, feeling her insides boil with the sheer hypocrisy. After the wake, when the three of them were alone, Serena decided it was time to get to the main point. Betty, she began in a coaxing voice, sitting down next to her on the sofa in her father's apartment. We understand how hard this is for you, and we want to spare you unnecessary trouble. What trouble? Betty asked, confused. Well, related to the inheritance. All those papers, notaries, cues, it's such a stress. Thomas and I will handle everything. You just need to sign one document. She took a neatly folded sheet of paper from her bag and handed it to Betty. What is this? Betty asked, though she already guessed. It's a renunciation of inheritance, her mother-in-law explained matter-of-factly. You'll renounce it in my favor. It'll be easier that way. I'll handle all the paperwork, sell what needs to be sold, put the money in a joint account, we'll use it together. Betty stared at her, unable to believe her ears. She was asking her to give up everything her parents had left her for the benefit of a woman who was essentially a stranger. I will not sign this, Betty said firmly. What do you mean you won't? Steel crept into Serena's voice. Don't you trust us? Your family? I have no family left, Betty replied quietly. My family is lying in the ground. Oh, so that's how you speak. Serena jumped up. So you've decided to keep everything for yourself? You want to control everything alone? And what about your husband? He, by the way, has rights too. He has no rights, Betty cut her off. This is my father's inheritance. And it will go only to me. We'll see about that, her mother-in-law hissed maliciously. Thomas, are you hearing this? She wants to rob us. Thomas, who had been silent until now, stepped closer to Betty. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. Betty, don't do this, he began uncertainly. Mom only wants what's best. Let's not fight. Sign it, and everything will be fine. No, Betty repeated. She saw him painfully shift his gaze from her to his mother. He was torn, but she knew who he would choose. He always chose his mother. Thomas, tell her. Serena commanded. Tell her what will happen if she doesn't sign. Thomas took a deep breath and looked at Betty. There was no anger in his eyes, only a pitiful resolve. Betty, he said quietly, either you sign or we get a divorce. There it was, the ultimatum. The vilest, cruelest blow imaginable. Not just a stab in the back, but right through the heart, already breaking from grief. Betty looked at her husband, at his mother standing behind him with a triumphant smile, and realized it was over. Over for everything. And in that moment, she remembered the folder her father had given her. You'll understand when the time comes. She understood. A heavy, ringing silence hung in the room. Outside, the persistent autumn rain drummed on the windowsill. Betty stared at her husband, at his pale, tense face, trying to find any trace of the Thomas she had once loved. She found none. Before her stood a stranger, a weak man repeating his mother's words like a mantra. "Divorce?" she repeated. Her voice was surprisingly calm. "You're threatening me with divorce on the day of my father's funeral?" "I'm not threatening," Thomas mumbled, looking away. "I just want everything to be fair." "Fair?" Betty scoffed bitterly. "That's when I have to give up everything my parents left me in favor of your mother? That's what you call fairness?" "It'll be ours together," Serena intervened, moving closer. Her eyes burned with greedy fire. "We're family. What's yours is ours. We'll invest it all in a joint project, buy a new apartment, a car." "You already have a car," Betty reminded her. "One my father helped you buy. And you live in an apartment mostly paid for by him. Isn't that enough?" "The benefactor speaks." Her mother-in-law snorted. "Throwing it in our faces now? We'll earn that money back 100 times over. Don't worry, you won't be at a loss. You'll live like a queen." "I don't want to live like a queen. I want to live in peace. And I want my parents' memory to remain untarnished by dirty boots." Betty stood, feeling a cold fury rise inside her. She walked to the table where the document had been slipped to her, the renunciation of inheritance form. Serena had neatly written her name, passport details, and the name of the person in whose favor the renunciation was being made, Serena Gonzalez. Everything was planned down to the smallest detail. "You left me no choice, Betty," Thomas said. His voice carried a hint of resentment, as if it were her fault that this was happening. "I don't want a divorce, but if you keep behaving like this, if you go against the family against your family," Betty corrected. "As far as I can see, I was never part of it. Just a temporary appendage. A convenient wallet." "Stop!" he shouted. "Don't talk like that." "And how am I supposed to talk?" Her voice broke. "My father died 3 days ago." 3 days. And you're already dividing his property. Don't you have anything sacred? "The sacred thing is family," Serena declared pompously. "And you're destroying it with your selfishness. You only think about yourself." Betty looked at her, then at Thomas. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a united front, two predators cornering their prey. And in that moment, she made a decision. She would not scream, would not cry, would not plead. She would play their game, but by her own rules. She silently took a pen from the table. Thomas and Serena froze, watching her. Impatience flickered across her mother-in-law's face. "Well, there's a smart girl," she cooed as Betty bent over the paper. "Why didn't you do this from the start? What were all those scenes for?" Betty didn't answer. She slowly, in calligraphic handwriting, signed her name at the bottom of the document, then set down the pen and straightened up. "All done," she said. "Happy now?" Thomas exhaled in relief. Serena beamed. She snatched the paper from Betty's hands and examined it as if it were a winning lottery ticket. "Now, that's more like it," she exclaimed triumphantly, waving the document. "See, Thomas? I told you she's a smart girl. She understands everything." She approached Betty and patted her shoulder patronizingly. "Don't worry, my dear, we won't hurt you. Everything will be fine. Now we're one big, happy family." Betty looked at her silently. She didn't see a caring mother-in-law before her, but a triumphant predator that had just devoured its prey. "Now that all the formalities are settled," Serena continued, "we need to rest. It's been a long day. Betty, make us some tea. Strong." And you, Thomas, go to the store and get a cake. Let's celebrate, she faltered, celebrate the beginning of a new life. Betty said nothing. She simply turned and walked to her room. She heard Thomas hesitate. Mom, maybe we don't need a cake? It feels awkward, and her mother-in-law replied imperiously, yes, Thomas, we do. We need to solidify our family bond. Closing the door behind her, Betty leaned against it. Her hands shook, her heart pounded wildly. She had done it. She had signed. She had voluntarily given them everything. Yet instead of despair, she felt a strange, cold calm. She remembered her father's face, his last words. She took out from her bag the very folder he had handed her. She hadn't opened it yet, but she knew, inside was her salvation. She knew the performance wasn't over. This was only the first act. And the most interesting plot twist was still ahead. She sat on the bed and smiled. For the first time in these dreadful days, she smiled. It was the smile of someone who knows the final move in this game would be theirs. They thought they had won. They were cruelly mistaken. After Betty signed the document, the atmosphere in the house changed sharply. Thomas and Serena, confident in their complete and unequivocal victory, stopped even pretending to be sympathetic. Their behavior became openly bossy and dismissive. They acted as if Betty were not a grieving widow and daughter but a poor relative they had graciously taken in. Betty, why is the kitchen a mess? Serena asked sternly the next morning, even though Betty hadn't yet gotten out of bed. You're at home now, you could at least clean up. I'm not at home. I'm in mourning, Betty replied quietly. Mourning or not, the house can't be neglected, her mother-in-law snapped. Your husband must come home to a clean house and a hot dinner. Remember that. Thomas supported his mother in everything. He stopped paying attention to Betty, speaking to her through gritted teeth only about household matters. In the evenings, she and Serena would sit in the kitchen for hours, discussing their plans for the new property. They did it loudly, demonstratively, so that Betty could hear everything. The house needs to be sold immediately, Serena said, scrolling through real estate websites on her tablet. Why do we need this ramshackle place outside the city? It's just expenses. This way we'll get good money. And this apartment too, Thomas agreed. It's in a good neighborhood, sure, but it's old. We'll sell it, add the money from the house, and buy a luxurious 3-bedroom in a new building with panoramic windows. And your car too, Thomas, it's time for an upgrade, continued his mother. It's unbecoming for such a prominent man to drive that junk. We'll get you a new crossover. Black. You'll ride like a king. Betty listened to these conversations from her room, and in her soul there was neither resentment nor anger. Only the cold curiosity of an entomologist observing the bustling of insects. They were so sure of their impunity, so blinded by greed, that they noticed nothing around them. She didn't argue, didn't object. She played her part as the broken, submissive victim. Silently cleaning, cooking, doing laundry. To all her mother-in-law's remarks she replied quietly, yes, Serena. To her husband's condescending comments, with silence. They took her submission at face value. See, I told you, her mother-in-law said to her son with satisfaction. She's broken. She understands who's in charge in this house. Now she'll be like silk. The main thing is to keep her under an iron fist. Meanwhile, Betty was living a secret life. She called the notary, a friend of her father, the very one whose contacts had been left in the folder. Gregory, hello. This is Betty Kennedy, Derek Brown's daughter. Betty, hello, my girl, came the warm, familiar voice over the line. Please accept my deepest condolences. Your father was a great man and a true friend. Thank you, Gregory. I'm calling on business. My father left me a folder with documents I know, he interrupted. He called me a day before everything happened. Told me everything and asked me to help you if needed. What happened? Betty briefly explained the situation, the ultimatum, the signed renunciation of the inheritance. The notary listened silently, occasionally humming in acknowledgement. Yes, he drawled when she finished. Your husband's family is quite a piece. But Derek was a genius. He outplayed them before the game even began. What should I do, Gregory? Nothing, he replied calmly. Sit quietly and wait. They'll come to you. Or rather, to me. When they bring that paper to formalize the inheritance, that's when the real fun begins. He paused and added, above all, hold on. And remember, the law is completely on your side. This conversation solidified her resolve. She knew she just had to wait a little longer. A few days after the funeral, Thomas approached her with a businesslike expression. Betty, we need to go to the notary to officially finalize everything. Why? She asked innocently. You said my signature was just a formality. It's necessary, he said bluntly. So there won't be any questions later. Mom found a good notary through her connections. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Be ready. Betty nodded obediently. That evening, Serena was in a great mood. She even bought expensive champagne. Well, my girl, she said, pouring the drink into glasses. Tomorrow is the great day, the beginning of our new wealthy life. Let's toast to that. She handed a glass to Betty. To a new life, Betty said quietly, taking a small sip. They didn't understand the true meaning of her words. They thought it was their new life. They didn't know it would be her life, a new life, free from them. At night, Betty took the folder from her secret stash. She opened it and, for the 100th time, reread the documents. The gift agreement for all the property, made out in her name and registered with the property registry a month before her father's death. And another document, which she had not yet told anyone about. Not even the notary. It was her personal trump card. Her father's final gift. She carefully folded the papers and put them back in her bag. Tomorrow would be the decisive day. The day when masks would be torn off. The day when justice would triumph. She fell asleep with a smile on her lips. She was ready for the battle. The week after the funeral dragged agonizingly long for Betty. Every day was like the last, filled with humiliation, reproaches, and demonstrative contempt. Serena had fully established herself as the mistress of the apartment she shared with her son. She rearranged the living room furniture to suit her taste, threw away Betty's favorite cup because it had an ugly crack, and constantly criticized everything her daughter-in-law did. Betty, you've oversalted the soup again, she said at lunch. My Thomas will get gastritis from your cooking. Learn to cook while I'm still alive. Betty, what's with those morning rags you wear? She frowned when Betty walked out of the room in a simple black dress. Your father died, yes, that's sorrow, but life goes on. Put on something brighter. A man likes it when a woman is beautiful. Thomas didn't just fail to defend his wife, he actively sided with his mother. He seemed to revel in his newfound power, in his impunity. Mom's right, Betty, he said with feigned strictness. You've let yourself go completely. Look at yourself. Betty stayed silent. She knew any word could be used against her. Any attempt to defend herself would be seen as rebellion, something that had to be immediately crushed. She became a shadow, a voiceless servant fulfilling all their whims. She did it deliberately, lulling their vigilance, giving them a taste of absolute power. They, in turn, grew increasingly detached from reality. Their confidence that Betty was entirely under their control made them careless. They stopped whispering in corners and began discussing their plans openly in front of her. "I've spotted an apartment for us," Serena said, showing Thomas something on the tablet screen. "The Imperial Residential Complex. Elite. 4 rooms, 2 bathrooms, river view. A dream." "Wow, Mom, can we afford it?" Thomas asked doubtfully. "Of course we can," his mother said confidently. "We'll sell that apartment of yours, well, this one, in the center. Sell the house. There'll still be money left for renovations and furnishings. I've already picked a designer. Italian." Betty, passing by with the vacuum cleaner, stopped involuntarily. They had already hired a designer for a house that wasn't theirs. The sheer arrogance of it stunned her. One evening, Thomas came home from work unusually excited. "I quit," he announced from the doorway. Betty and Serena looked at him in surprise. "Quit? Why?" Serena threw up her hands. "Why should I slave for that man for pennies?" Thomas replied smugly. "I'm a wealthy heir now. I'm starting my own business. A car dealership. Always dreamed of it. My golden son." Serena beamed. "Now that's manly. The right decision." She rushed to hug him. Betty watched silently. He had quit his job. He hadn't even consulted her, his wife. He had simply decided he could now afford it, at her expense. "And what will we live on while you start your business?" she asked quietly. Thomas and his mother looked at her like an annoying fly. "Not your concern," Thomas snapped. "There's money. Or rather, there will be. Very soon." Betty's patience was wearing thin. She wanted to scream, tell them everything she thought of them, throw the folder with documents in their faces. But she restrained herself. She just had to wait a little longer, until the visit to the notary. The day before that, Serena decided to hold a family council. "All right," she said, seating Betty and Thomas at the kitchen table. "Tomorrow we go to the notary, and I officially assume my inheritance rights. After that, we put everything up for sale immediately. I've already arranged it with the realtor. Maybe we shouldn't rush?" Betty spoke up for the first time. "It's only been 10 days since Dad died. Why wait?" Her mother-in-law asked in surprise. "Until property prices drop?" "No, my girl, you strike while the iron's hot." She turned to Thomas again. "As soon as we get the money, we pay off your mortgage." "Why?" Thomas didn't understand. "We're selling this apartment anyway," Serena explained, as if to a child. "So we can sell it as ours, without encumbrances. We'll get more money that way." And Betty, she turned to her daughter-in-law. "You'll need to deregister from this apartment." "Why?" Betty asked, now genuinely surprised. "So there won't be extra problems when selling. You'll register with me for now, and when we buy a new, bigger apartment, you'll register there. If, of course, you behave well," she added with a sly smile. Betty felt a wave of nausea rising in her throat. They weren't just planning to strip her bare, they wanted to take even her last possession, her registration. To make her completely powerless, utterly dependent on their will. "All right," she said quietly, lowering her eyes. She saw Serena and Thomas exchange triumphant glances. They were sure they had broken her completely. They didn't know that this was her final all right. Her last concession before the decisive battle. That night, Betty hardly slept. She sat by the window, looking out at the city at night. She thought of her father, of his love, of his wisdom. It was as if he had foreseen all of this. He knew the people she would have to face. And he had prepared her. He hadn't just left her an inheritance. He had given her a weapon to protect both that inheritance and her own dignity. Tomorrow, she thought, it will all be over. Tomorrow I will reclaim my life. She took a voice recorder from her bag. A small, inconspicuous device she had bought the day after the funeral. It had been running ever since, recording every conversation, every humiliation, every threat. This was her second ace, just in case. She felt like a soldier before the decisive battle. She was scared, but there was no retreat. Behind her was the memory of her father. Ahead lay a new, free life. And she was ready to fight for it. The morning of the decisive day was bright and frosty. Betty woke with an extraordinary clarity in her mind. The fear that had haunted her for days was gone, leaving behind a cold, steel-like determination. She didn't dress in morning black but in an elegant cream-colored pantsuit that accentuated her slender figure. She applied light makeup and styled her hair. She wanted to look like a victor, not a victim. When she entered the kitchen, Thomas and Serena were already having breakfast. They froze for a moment when they saw her. "Well, look who decided to dress up," her mother-in-law said sarcastically. "Going to a celebration, actually," Betty replied calmly, pouring herself some coffee. "A celebration of liberation." They didn't understand her words, dismissing them as another of her oddities. "Hurry up," Thomas urged. "We don't want to be late for the notary." They rode in the taxi in complete silence. Serena and Thomas sat in the back, animatedly discussing the details of the renovation for their future luxury apartment. Betty sat up front, next to the driver, gazing at the passing streets of Chicago. She was completely calm. She knew what awaited her. The notary office that Serena had found through a contact was located in an old building downtown. Seeing the sign, Betty could barely suppress a smile. Notary Gregory. It was her father's friend. In their haste and greed, they hadn't even bothered to check whom they were dealing with. They had led themselves to the scaffold. Gregory, an elderly man with gray hair and intelligent, piercing eyes, greeted them in his office. He politely shook hands with Serena and Thomas and gave Betty a warm, fatherly smile. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chairs in front of his massive oak desk. "Gregory, we have a very important matter," Serena began, unable to sit down even. She was excited and impatient. With a triumphant look, she placed a paper signed by Betty on the desk. "Renunciation of inheritance. In my favor. We need to have it officially notarized." The notary put on his glasses and leisurely picked up the document. He studied it carefully and at length. The office was silent, interrupted only by the loud ticking of an antique wall clock. Thomas and Serena fidgeted in their chairs, impatiently awaiting a verdict. Betty sat still, hands folded on her lap. Yes," Gregory finally said, setting the paper aside. "The document is certainly interesting. I see Betty's signature is present. So, what now?" Serena couldn't contain herself. "Can we process it?" "Process what?" The notary asked calmly. "What do you mean, what?" "The inheritance," the mother-in-law exclaimed. "I'm the sole heir now." Gregory removed his glasses and looked at her over them. His gaze held a mixture of pity and contempt. "Dear Serena," he began slowly, pronouncing each word clearly, "I'm afraid I must disappoint you." He lightly tapped the paper with his finger. "This document has absolutely no legal force." How is this possible?" the mother-in-law stammered. Red patches began spreading across her face. But she signed it. Here's her signature. You can sign anything, the notary shrugged. Even a deed to the moon. But, first of all, a renunciation of inheritance is executed completely differently, in a strictly legally prescribed form, and only through a notary. And second, and this is the most important part, he paused, savoring the effect. You can only renounce something that actually exists. In this case, he spread his hands, there is no inheritance. What do you mean, there isn't? Thomas finally intervened, having sat silently until now, not understanding what was happening. What about the apartment, the house, the car, the bank accounts? All of that? Dear Thomas, Gregory cast a heavy glance at him, all of that no longer belonged to your late father-in-law at the time of his death. He opened a desk drawer and took out another folder, the very one Betty had handed him a month before her passing. His voice sounded like a verdict. Derek Brown executed a gift agreement, by which he transferred all his movable and immovable property, free of charge, into the full ownership of his only daughter, Betty Kennedy. He placed the document with the blue seal on the desk. The agreement was registered in accordance with the law and has full legal force. So, as you understand, there is simply nothing to inherit from Derek Brown. A dead silence fell over the office. Serena's heavy, hissing breaths could be heard. Thomas stared at the gift agreement, his face gradually taking on a sallow hue. They understood. They understood everything. Their grand plan had collapsed. Their dreams of a wealthy life lay in ruins. They had lost. And Betty sat across from them, silently watching. There was no gloating or triumph in her eyes, only cold, calm satisfaction. Justice had prevailed. Her father had ensured it. The climax had come, and it was only the beginning of their downfall. Serena was the first to snap out of her stupor. Her face contorted with rage. This is a forgery!" she shrieked, jumping up and pointing at the gift agreement. "He couldn't have done this. He was sick, not in his right mind." She cast a look of pure hatred at Betty. She deceived him, took advantage of his helpless state. "This is fraud." "Madam, I must ask you to calm down," Gregory said sternly. "Derek was of full health and sound mind when he signed this document. I have the corresponding medical certificate made that very day, so your accusations are unfounded and, I would say, offensive. I'll complain. I'll sue." Serena continued, her voice breaking into a shriek. "I'll prove that you were all in cahoots. You, she, her father, scammers." "Mom, stop," Thomas said quietly. He still sat slouched, staring blankly at one point, as if all the air had been knocked out of him. "Don't you dare shut me up," she roared at her son. "Can't you see? We've been robbed. Brazenly, cynically robbed, and you sit there like a coward." She turned back to Betty. "Well, are you satisfied?" she hissed. "Happy you fooled everyone? Thought we wouldn't find out?" Betty remained silent. She let them vent all their anger, all their venom. She wanted them to show their true selves. And they had. "I don't understand," Thomas finally managed, raising a confused look to Betty. "Betty, why? Why didn't you say anything sooner? And what would that have changed, Thomas?" Betty spoke for the first time during the ordeal. Her voice was calm, yet steel rang through it. "Would you have stopped humiliating me? Stopped counting my dying father's money? Stopped threatening me with divorce?" He was silent. He knew he had no answer. "No," Betty continued. "You would have simply found another way to take everything from me. I gave you a chance. A chance to show that you still had some humanity left. You didn't take it. You showed me who you really are. Greedy, deceitful, unscrupulous people. How dare you? Serena erupted again. I dare, Betty cut in. I dare now because I am speaking to you not as your powerless daughter-in-law, but as the owner of everything you so greedily coveted. She stood. Her calm and confidence affected them more than any shouting or accusations. The game is over, she said, looking them directly in the eyes. You lost. Serena broke into a hysterical cough. Thomas clasped his head in his hands. They were crushed. Destroyed. Their world, built on calculation and greed, collapsed in an instant. And that's not all, Betty added, pulling a small device from her bag. I have something interesting for you. She pressed the button on the voice recorder. The office filled with familiar voices, signed the renunciation of inheritance in favor of my mother, or I'll file for divorce. Brooke finally realized who's in charge here. Now she'll be like silk. Why should I slave away for this uncle for pennies? I'm a rich heir now. With every phrase, Thomas and Serena's faces grew paler. They listened to recordings of their own conversations, their threats, their cynical schemes. It was the final blow. Blackmail, psychological pressure, pushing someone to the edge. They heard it all, and Betty commented on each line. I think this will be more than enough for court. Not just for the divorce proceedings, but possibly for a criminal case as well. Gregory nodded approvingly. Yes, your evidence is solid, Betty. Serena slowly sank into her chair. She looked at Betty with horror and fear. For the first time in their acquaintance, she was afraid of her. She saw before her not a timid orphan girl, but a cold, calculating opponent who had thought several moves ahead. An opponent trained to play by her father's rules. What? What do you want? Thomas whispered. Betty smirked. I want a divorce immediately. I want both of you out of my life. Forever. She turned to the notary. Gregory, I think that's all for today. We can go. Of course, Betty, he said, rising. And you, dear sirs? He added, I'd advise you to find a good lawyer as soon as possible. You're going to need one. They left the office, leaving Thomas and Serena sitting amidst the ruins of their collapsed world. Betty walked down the corridor with her back perfectly straight. She felt neither joy nor relief, only the cold, all-consuming sense of justice. She had endured her personal emotional breaking point in the apartment when they humiliated her. She had been reforged in the fire of that humiliation and was now ready to start a new life. A life where there would be no place for lies or betrayal. Stepping out of the notary office into the sunlit street, Betty took a deep breath. The air felt different, pure, fresh, intoxicating. It was as if she had spent weeks in a stuffy, stifling basement and had finally emerged into freedom. Well, Betty? Congratulations on your baptism by fire, Gregory said, squinting in the sunlight. You held up well. Your father would be proud of you. Thank you, Betty said sincerely. If it weren't for you, I only did what I promised a friend, he interrupted. The real work was done by you and your father. He didn't just leave you property, he left you armor and taught you how to use it. They said their goodbyes. Betty didn't go home. She wandered through the city. She needed to be alone, to process everything that had happened. She walked familiar streets but saw them in a new light. The world around her hadn't changed. She had. The pain of losing her father had not gone away. It would always remain a dull, aching wound in her heart. But that pain was no longer mixed with fear or helplessness. Instead, she felt her father's unseen support, his presence beside her. He was her guardian angel. She entered a small cafe, ordered a cappuccino, and pulled out her phone. Dozens of missed calls from Thomas and his mother. Without hesitation, she added their numbers to the blacklist and dialed her friend Katia. "Katia, hi. It's over," she said. "How did it go?" Her friend asked anxiously. Like in the movies, Betty smiled. Exposures, hysterics, and a complete fiasco for the villains. She briefly recounted the scene at the notary's office. Katia on the other end could only gasp. "Betty, you're my hero," she said in awe. "I told you you were strong. So what will you do now?" "Live," Betty answered simply. "Just live." After the call with her friend, she felt an incredible surge of strength. The despair that had weighed on her all these days was replaced with active energy. She no longer wanted to sit idly and pity herself. She wanted to act. She opened her laptop, which she always carried with her, and began searching for information. First on the list, a divorce lawyer. The best in the city. She no longer wanted to skimp on herself. Next, a realtor. The mortgage department needed to be sold as soon as possible to sever the last ties with her past life. She spent several hours in the cafe, drafting a plan of action: divorce, sale of the apartment, moving into her father's house, resuming work, and possibly even starting her own small business, a boutique landscape design studio. Plans that had seemed unattainable just yesterday now looked entirely realistic. And she realized she had everything she needed: financial resources, willpower, and most importantly, freedom. By the time she left the cafe, dusk was falling. The city had lit its lights. Betty walked down the street, smiling for the first time in a long while. She felt like a different person. The naive, trusting girl who had feared contradicting her husband and mother-in-law was dead. She had died there, at her father's grave, when that vile document had been thrust into her hands. In her place, a new woman was born, strong, confident, self-assured. A woman who would no longer allow anyone to trample over her. She remembered how Thomas and Serena had constantly called her a poor orphan. They thought it was her weakness. They didn't realize it had become her greatest strength. Having lost everything, she had found herself. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. She would have to rebuild her life, learn to be alone, make decisions, and take responsibility for them. But she no longer feared difficulties. She arrived at her parents' house, entered the building, climbed to her floor, and unlocked the door with her key. The apartment greeted her with silence and peace. It was her fortress, her sanctuary. She went into her father's study and sat in his old leather chair. His photograph rested on the desk. He smiled at her, full of love and pride. "I'll manage, Dad," Betty whispered. "I promise." At that moment, she realized that the internal transformation that had been building in her over the past days was complete. She was no longer a victim. She was the master of her own life. And she would write its story anew, without fear, without doubt, without looking back at the past. The next morning, Betty was awakened by a persistent knock at the door. She looked at the clock, 7 a.m. Who could come at such an hour? Peering through the peephole, she saw Thomas. He was alone, without his mother. He looked terrible, pale, disheveled, stubbly. Betty didn't open the door, she just watched him through the peephole. He rang for several more minutes, then began pounding on the door. "Betty, open up." His muffled voice reached her. "I know you're there. We need to talk." Betty remained silent. She had no intention of talking to him. All conversations had ended yesterday at the notary's office. "Betty, I beg you," his voice broke. I won't leave until you open. She calmly took her phone and called the lawyer she had found yesterday, explaining the situation. Do not open under any circumstances, the lawyer said firmly. And do not enter into negotiations. Call the police immediately. Tell them your ex-husband is breaking into your apartment and threatening you. Betty did exactly that. 15 minutes later, a police patrol arrived at the building. Seeing the officers, Thomas immediately shrank. Betty heard him mumbling something about a family misunderstanding, but the police were resolute. They took his statement, issued a fine for disturbing public order, and strictly forbade him from approaching her apartment. This incident became the last straw for Betty. She realized half measures wouldn't suffice. She needed to act quickly and decisively. That same day, she met with the lawyer. I want to file for divorce as soon as possible, she declared. And I want them to vacate my mortgaged apartment immediately. There won't be any issues with the divorce, the lawyer nodded. Given the evidence of blackmail, the court will most likely dissolve your marriage at the first hearing. But the apartment is trickier, he noted. Technically, it was purchased during the marriage, so he is entitled to half. But the down payment was entirely covered by my father, Betty objected. And he helped with the payments. I have all the bank statements. That's a strong argument, the lawyer agreed. We can prove in court that his contribution was minimal, but it will take time. I don't have time, Betty cut him off. I don't want those people living in an apartment my father paid for. There's another way, the lawyer pondered. Riskier, but faster. We can use their own weapon against them, blackmail. He explained the plan to her. It was audacious, almost borderline reckless, but Betty liked it. That evening, following the lawyer's instructions, she sent Thomas a text, "Come to my apartment tomorrow at noon with your mother. My lawyer will be there. We'll discuss the terms of your eviction." She knew they would come. Their greed and fear outweighed their pride. Exactly at noon, they were at the doorstep. Serena looked defiant, Thomas despondent. Betty's lawyer was already waiting for them in the apartment. "Come in," Betty said, gesturing toward the chairs in the living room. She took a seat opposite them. So, the lawyer began, wasting no time on preamble. "We have two possible courses of action. Option 1, we meet in court. Betty files for divorce and division of property. We present evidence that 90% of the apartment's value was paid from her father's funds. The court will most likely award your son," he nodded at Thomas, "a minimal compensation. Additionally, Betty will file against you," he looked at Serena, "a charge of blackmail and extortion. We have a recording of the conversation. Given your age, you're unlikely to serve real time, but a suspended sentence is very possible. Plus a ruined reputation and nerves." Serena went pale, Thomas hunched his shoulders. "Option 2, the lawyer continued, you sign an agreement for the voluntary division of property, transferring full ownership of the apartment to Betty. You waive all claims. In return, Betty will not pursue the blackmail case." He paused. "She also forgives your son half of the debt under the gift agreement." Thomas and Serena exchanged glances. A flicker of hope appeared in their eyes. Forgiving half the debt was a generous offer. "We agree," Thomas managed to say. "I thought so," the lawyer smirked. He pulled out pre-prepared documents from his briefcase. "Here's the agreement. You can review it." Serena, a former accountant, clutched the document, reading every line carefully. Thomas just sat, staring blankly ahead. "It says here," she raised her eyes, "that we must vacate the apartment within 24 hours. "Exactly," confirmed the lawyer. "Tomorrow, at the same time, Betty will come to take possession of the apartment. I would advise you not to leave a mess behind." "This is impossible," the mother-in-law exclaimed. "Where will we go? We have nowhere to live." "That's no longer our problem," Betty said coldly. "You had a wonderful apartment, but you chose to sell it to invest in a financial pyramid. Isn't that right, Serena?" Her mother-in-law shuddered and stared at Betty. How do you know?" "My father was a good investigator," Betty smiled. "And he knew how to gather information. He knew everything about you, your debts, your schemes. That's why he was prepared. He was protecting me from you." That was her final, decisive blow. She watched her husband completely break and his mother's arrogance collapse. They realized that from the very beginning they had been mere pawns in the game her father had orchestrated, a game in which they were doomed to lose. "Sign," she said. They signed with trembling hands, avoiding each other's gaze. The decisive answer had been given, and it was crushing. The next 24 hours became a nightmare for Thomas and Serena. The awareness of total collapse and the need to hurriedly vacate the apartment they already considered theirs weighed heavily on them. Following her lawyer's advice, Betty did not attend their packing. She spent the day with a friend, giving them the chance to leave without witnesses to their humiliation. Exactly at noon the next day, she, along with Katia and 2 strong men from the cleaning company she had prudently hired, approached the door of her mortgaged apartment. The keys, as agreed, were under the doormat. The apartment was empty. They had taken everything, their furniture, their clothes, their appliances. But contrary to Betty's expectations, they did not leave a mess. On the contrary, the apartment was surprisingly clean. Apparently, fear of legal consequences outweighed the desire to make a last mess. On the kitchen table lay a single key and a note written in Thomas's handwriting, a mailbox key. "Goodbye, and that's all." "Well, friend, congratulations on a final and unconditional victory," Katia said, hugging Betty. "Now this is truly your fortress." Betty surveyed the empty rooms. Her feelings were mixed. On one hand, she felt immense relief, the nightmare was over. On the other, a tinge of sadness lingered. After all, for years of her life had passed within these walls, for years that now seemed like one big misunderstanding. "We need to change the locks," she said businesslike, brushing away unwelcome memories, "and do a deep clean. I want to wash away the whole spirit of this place." While the cleaning crew scrubbed the apartment until it gleamed, Betty sat on the windowsill, looking out over the city. She felt empty, yet free at the same time. The conflict was over. Justice, harsh though it had been, had prevailed. She knew she had been ruthless. She could have given them more time, could have refused to forgive half the debt. But she had realized an important truth: with people like them, you cannot play nobly. They only understand the language of power. Any concession is perceived as weakness, and they immediately try to take advantage. Her father, a wise man, had taught her this, not with words, but with his final act. A week later, the first and last court hearing on their divorce took place. Thomas and Serena did not attend, sending their lawyer, who confirmed their complete agreement with all the terms. The judge, an elderly woman with tired eyes, reviewed the signed agreement and simply shook her head. Without further questions, she granted the divorce. Thus ended Betty's family life, without drama, without scandal, quietly and uneventfully. Betty didn't linger in the apartment. Once she had the divorce documents and the property title in her hands, she put it up for sale. The realtor, an energetic middle-aged woman, found buyers within 2 weeks. With the money in hand, Betty immediately paid off the mortgage in full. She deposited the remaining sum into an account. She had no plans to buy a new apartment. She had a home, her father's house. The move was exciting. She hired a truck, transported her belongings, books, and clothes. When she stepped into the house, now hers alone, she felt she had truly returned home. Every corner breathed memories of her father, his books in the study, his fishing rods in the closet, his favorite rocking chair on the porch. But these memories no longer brought sharp pain, they brought warmth and a sense of security. She slowly settled in, unpacked her things, and arranged her favorite trinkets on the shelves. Every evening, she lit the fireplace, sat in her father's chair, wrapped herself in a blanket, and read. She was learning to live again. To live for herself. She knew many challenges lay ahead. She needed to find a new job, new friends, a new purpose. But she was no longer afraid. She knew she could handle it. The resolution of the conflict had given her not only freedom but understanding, the realization that true strength lies not in forgiving betrayal, but in knowing when to say no. Not in enduring humiliation for the sake of a family illusion, but in having the courage to leave and start anew. She sat on the porch, gazing at the starry sky, thinking how extraordinary life was. Sometimes it deals cruel blows, taking away those closest to us. But sometimes, in return, it gives something greater, a chance to become stronger, wiser, to find oneself. And Betty was determined not to miss that chance. The worst was behind her. Ahead lay a whole life, and she was ready to live it. A year passed. During that time, Betty's life changed beyond recognition. She did not look for an office job. Instead, she decided to pursue a long-held dream, turning her passion for landscape design into a profession. She invested part of the money from the apartment sale into her education, completed prestigious courses, did several internships. Her first major project was her father's garden. She completely transformed the neglected yard into a work of art. She posted photos of her work online, creating a small portfolio website. Orders came quickly, first from neighbors, then from their friends. Word of mouth worked better than any advertisement. Within a year, she had her own small firm, several assistants, and a waiting list of clients a month ahead. She worked tirelessly, with excitement and passion. Her work became her calling, her outlet, her form of self-expression. She gained financial independence and, most importantly, confidence in herself. She rarely thought about Thomas and his mother. He dutifully paid off the remaining debt, though the money was automatically deducted from his account via the court order. Her lawyer informed her that Thomas never opened his car dealership, he remained in the same job and position. Serena, rumor had it, had deteriorated significantly after the whole affair, transforming from a domineering mother queen into a quiet, grumbling old woman. Betty felt neither anger nor sympathy toward them. They simply ceased to exist for her, becoming shadows of a past she had let go. Her life was now filled with work, friends, and travel. She read extensively, went to the theater, took up yoga. She learned to enjoy solitude, to find harmony rather than emptiness in it. One warm summer evening, she sat on her favorite porch, drinking herbal tea and admiring the sunset. Birds sang in the garden, roses and freshly cut grass filled the air with fragrance. She felt utterly happy. At that moment, the gate creaked quietly. A man stood on the path, tall, handsome, with a kind smile. He was her new neighbor, a surgeon, who had recently bought the house across the street. "Good evening," he said, slightly embarrassed. "Sorry to bother you. I'm Simon. We haven't met yet. I just wanted to say your garden is incredibly beautiful. I admire it every day from my window." "Thank you," Betty smiled. "It's my work. Would you like some tea?" He gladly accepted. They talked late into the night about everything under the sun, books, music, travel, work. With him, Betty felt at ease and intrigued, feelings she hadn't experienced with anyone for a very long time. She didn't know what this acquaintance would bring. Perhaps it would grow into a great love. Or perhaps it would remain simply a pleasant memory. But she knew one thing for certain: she was no longer afraid to open her heart. She had endured betrayal, but she had not lost the ability to trust. She had survived pain, but she had not lost faith in people. She sat on the porch of the house that had become her fortress, looking at the man who might become her future. She was grateful to fate for everything, even for the terrible trials she had faced. For it was thanks to them that she had become who she was now, strong, free, and ready for new happiness. This story is a hymn to female strength and dignity. It is about the fact that even after the darkest night, the dawn always comes.